for attending the last session of our seminar series this semester. So I'm going to just introduce Delwyn, who will introduce the other speakers, or they will introduce each other as they go. And Delwyn admonished me to keep my introduction to 10 seconds maximum. So I will try to keep it short, but probably I've already gone over the 10 seconds. So I just want to say that Delwyn is one of the smartest and nicest people I've ever met. And I have had the honor of knowing him since 1983, which puts dates on both of us. But, you know, I had the pleasure of working with him back then when he was a brand new master's student in civil engineering at the University of Hawaii. And it's, you know, to my benefit and pleasure that I had a chance to work with him over the years and watch him as he's progressed through a stellar career and as certainly one of the top hydrologists in Hawaii and the Pacific. So I'll just leave it at that and just say we're really honored to have you and your colleagues here and to hear about all the, or some of the cool work you're doing at the USGS Pacific Island Water Science Center. So thanks very much, Delwyn.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tom. And thanks, Harry and Tom, for giving us this opportunity to present results of our study. So I'm the first of 5 speakers from the USGS, and I'll be talking about, we're going to be presenting a few of our studies that either have been recently completed or that are very soon to be completed, or that maybe about a year off or so. Some of these are already published, like this study that I'll be talking about is already published, so there's a report out in case you're interested. Next speaker is Kolja Rotzoll will be talking about a similar project on Maui, but that report is going to be coming out maybe in another 6 months to a year. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about groundwater availability on the island of Moloka. This is the kind of a skeleton outline of the presentation. And the co-authors on this report were John Engot and Kolja Rotzoll. And this study was done in cooperation with the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and the Maui Department of Water Supply. The main area of interest for this study is the Waikapū area in central Moloka, and that's outlined in blue on the screen. There are a number of wells, existing wells in that area. Only 4 of them are actually active production wells, and that's the kind of the cluster in the middle of those green dots, between the 2 extreme green dots. Also on this map, you can see there are a number of these orange splotches, and those represent volcanic vents, which are hydrologically significant because they represent the surface expression of subsurface volcanic dikes. And the dikes are important because they tend to impede the flow of groundwater. So within that Waihe Aquifer system, it's kind of scattered with these volcanic vents, which are, again, the surface expression of volcanic dikes in the subsurface. And you'll see in a subsequent slide the hydrologic effect of these dikes that tends to build up the groundwater behind them. Okay, so there are a few factors that can control groundwater availability, and one of them is some of the nearshore areas that are fed by groundwater discharge. So what this map shows are a number of subsistence sites that have been identified by the community mainly, and these are primarily offshore sites that potentially rely on discharge of groundwater to maintain their efficacy as subsistence sites. Also, you can see along the southern coast of the island, there are a number of those green areas which represent cultural fish ponds, and some of these are in different stages of restoration. And these fish ponds typically require some form of groundwater discharge for productivity. So the objective of our study is to evaluate groundwater availability in central Molokai. The approach we took was to, first of all, estimate groundwater recharge over the entire island using a water budget model. We then used that groundwater recharge as input to an island-wide groundwater flow model. And that flow model helped us to define boundary inflows to the main area of interest, where we developed a more refined and complex groundwater flow and transport model. And that more complex model was used to evaluate groundwater availability. And finally, we developed a number of scenarios, withdrawal scenarios, that were developed in consultation with a number of the stakeholders, including the cooperating agencies and the Commission on Water Resource Management. So the first aspect of the study was to estimate the groundwater recharge rates island-wide, and we did that decadally. And as you can see in the bar graph, the wettest decade was the 1960s, during which groundwater recharge was close to 280 million gallons per day over the entire island. And the driest decade was the 1970s, during which groundwater recharge was about 190 million gallons per day. And you can see on that map kind of the general distribution of groundwater recharge over the island during the latest period, with the bluer and greener colors representing the wetter areas with more recharge, and the orange areas representing the drier areas. Okay, so as I mentioned, we actually developed two different groundwater models for this study. The first was an island model, and that is outlined in the orange. And then we also developed a more refined study area model, which is outlined in the purple. And you can see that there's some blue arrows going into the purple area. Those were the boundary inflows that were determined from the island-wide model. So we started off at a larger island-wide scale, and then we kind of reduced that to looking at the main area of interest. And the island-wide model is much less complex. It's only a two-dimensional model, whereas the area outlined in purple is a bit more complex and numerically, computationally intensive. I'll show you next an animation of a groundwater simulation that was done to simulate conditions from 1940 to about 2012 or 13. It's a cross-section of the island looking from the east side of the island to the west, and you can see where that cross-section is on the map. The cross-section has the bluer areas, kind of showing the fresh-water, and the red area, the deeper zone, showing the salt water. And you can see that the blue freshwater area gets thicker, kind of more towards the right of the screen, and that's the result of those volcanic vents, the feeder dikes to those vents that kind of impede groundwater discharge, and it kind of builds up the freshwater resource behind it. Okay, so in the animation, what I'm actually going to do, and I'll show you that in the next slide, is remove all the bluest area, the freshwater with less than 1% ocean water salinity. And that'll enable you to see the movement of the transition zone, the brackish water, how it moves upward over time in response to groundwater withdrawal. And also by removing the fresh water, it exposes the locations of the production wells in the Waikapū area. The bar graph in the upper right will kind of give you a history of how the groundwater pumpage varied over time. Okay, so I'll run through this animation, and I can go through it a couple times. It's kind of slicing through the aquifer, zooming in, and then rotating it so that you're going to be looking from the east side of the island and coming in, and now it's going to start marching through time from 1940. And you can see the wells coming into play, the transition zone, that brackish water, that colorful area is going to start moving. And in the late 80s, early 90s, it's going to start going up as groundwater pumpage increases in the area. So we'll go through that one more time real quick. slice through the aquifer, and then kind of zoom in. So this is what the model simulated this time period, and we use it to kind of help us evaluate how well the model is performing. And in general, it did a reasonable job because we do see some increases in salinity as time progresses. Okay, so once we had a model that we were fairly satisfied with, we ran a number of scenarios. First of all, we developed a base scenario, which consisted of average withdrawals during 2017. Yeah. Is someone speaking? Okay. Groundwater recharge is kind of an average condition. And what the model is capable of doing is quantifying groundwater discharge to the nearshore environment. So the colored boxes along the coastlines represent the magnitude of the groundwater discharge, with the darker squares representing greater groundwater discharge. So this is kind of the baseline condition we started with. And then we ran a number of different withdrawal scenarios. And I'll show you a couple of them. This one is numbered scenario 2 in the report. And I didn't renumber it for this presentation, just to keep things kind of consistent with what's been documented. And in this scenario, we actually increased the withdrawal from the base case by over 1 million gallons per day in the Waihe aquifer system. And what that does is it tends to reduce the groundwater discharge to the nearshore area. And so the colored boxes in this slide represent the reduction in groundwater discharge to the nearshore area. And with the darker colors representing a reduction in discharge. Okay, so this is kind of a scenario in which the Water Commission wanted to look at what would happen if wells were pumped at the pending water use permit rates, pending as of about 2019. And in the next slide, I'll show you a scenario in which withdrawals were increased by adding some additional wells. And you'll see that the colored squares are going to get darker and kind of more extensive. The dark colors are going to get more extensive. So this scenario is when we added some additional wells, and we're now pumping from the Waihe aquifer system about 3.5 million gallons per day. So it's an increase in withdrawal from wells, and that has a corresponding effect on the groundwater discharge to the nearshore area, where you're starting to get a greater impact. It causes increased reduction in withdrawal to the nearshore area. So these groundwater models are useful for helping us quantify what the impacts might be. Unfortunately, as hydrologists, we don't really have the expertise to evaluate whether or not those impacts are going to be acceptable or not. So this is kind of a summary of our results. The model results indicate that the rate of withdrawals and the distribution of the withdrawals are kind of important factors that control groundwater availability. But the impacts of the withdrawals, we know that there is going to be some impact, but really managers and stakeholders must evaluate whether or not these effects are going to be acceptable or not. And of course, with any groundwater modeling study, as the actual person who put the blood, sweat, and tears into developing the model, I fully understand that it has many limitations. First of all, it's a regional scale, so it's not great at predicting things at a local scale. There's lots of uncertainty in terms of the water budget recharge estimates, as well as the subsurface geology is actually relatively poorly known. So these are some of the things that we struggle with, but as time goes on and we get more information, we can start developing better tools. To the next speaker, who is Dr. Kolja Rotzoll, who has actually been a USGS employee for only about 1.5 years, but he has been working with the USGS, with our office, very closely for over a decade, working on a number of different groundwater related projects. And then I'm going to turn it over to you, Kolja, and you can take over.
Thank you, Delwyn. Well, you will see a lot of, can you hear me? Okay. You can see a lot of similarities between this study and Delwyn's study, although the study area differs and also the objective is a little bit different. I'm going to talk about groundwater availability in the central Maui area. And there have been a couple of studies already been done in this area. In 2008, Steve Gingrich published the first one that covered almost the entire West Maui and parts of Haleakala. Then in 2012, the west side of West Maui, the Lahaina area, was updated with because new data was available and there was some new interest from the water department that was done. And now this study now focuses only on the central Maui part, Iao, Waikapū, and Waihe Aquifer. And you can see the study area is shrinking while the title of the study is getting longer. What the interest now is, the study is partially funded by, or is totally funded by the Maui Water Department. And the reason why we're just updating this is because there were a couple of changes to the hydrology. First of all, between 20 and 2014, about 25 million gallons per day of water that was diverted before to ditches is now being restored to streams. And that results in about 12.5 million gallons per day of groundwater recharge to the stream channels in the Navaihea area. That, of course, is a tremendous amount of water that comes additionally to the area. Another thing that changed is that during 15, a shaft that was in the Iao Aquifer system that had been withdrawn about 5 million gallons per day on average was shut down after being in production for about 70 years. That, of course, makes an impact. And another big factor is sugarcane production on Maui ended in 2016. And you can see in my study area, the average withdrawals were the average withdrawals before the shutdown were about 46 million gallons a day. And after the shutdown, about 25 million gallons. So almost half of it, which is, yeah, of course, a huge player in the question of groundwater availability. Now the objective is we have together with the Maui and Water Department, we have developed several withdrawal scenarios, and we're going to evaluate the effects of those, how they're going to have on the freshwater lens. So first, what we did is we had to calculate recharge for selected periods using a water budget model, and then we're going to develop a transport model. We're going to use Sutra for this, again, the same as Delwyn used. Complicated transport model, runs long times, and it's very difficult to calibrate, but eventually we're able to use a lot of observed water levels, salinity profiles, as well as chloride concentrations of pumped water, which we and then can use in the calibrated model to use several stakeholder developed groundwater withdrawal scenarios. And I'm going to present you a couple of those. So here's an example of how the recharge looks like. You can see that different periods will have different amounts of water coming into the system. And obviously the area that was taken by sugarcane has a huge impact in terms of irrigation that goes into the system. And now we have a cross section through the model. I'm going to only show you the upper half of the model. Oh, by the way, but I didn't mention before, we're not going to simulate the entire island. We're only going to simulate like a half donut. Fluxes from the high level area, the dike impounded area in the center of the West Maui Mountain are going to be calculated using a separate model and to account for those. And now I'm going to only show you the top half of this donut, and I'm going to looking in basically from the south, looking at the freshwater lens, how it changes over time. I'm not going to have a video. I'm only going to toggle back and forth between the two end dates, 1926 and 2012. And you can see that over that time, the freshwater lens has shrunken tremendously due to increased withdrawals over the period. And so now we'll have several scenarios. The first is, of course, is the baseline scenario that we're going to simulate. We're going to use recharge, which is average recharge between 1980 and 2010 with no sugarcane, and also the 12.5 million gallons per day, which I mentioned earlier, that are going to be added additional recharge from restored stream flow. And the withdrawal is going to be 2017, 2018 average rates. which are about in the study area of those 3 aquifers, are 20.2 million gallons a day. No withdrawals from the sugar industry wells. And so this is a similar plot that Delwyn has shown, where we're going to show dots for each of the production well from the Maui Water Department. The size is indicating the withdrawal rate, and the color is going to be indicating the amount or the salinity of the water that's been pumped. So the larger the dot is, the higher the pumping rate is, and the more, if you're going from green over yellow to the purple areas, that's increasing the salinity. And of course, you want to keep it in the green area to have nice fresh water that's suitable for drinking water. In our baseline scenario, all of the wells show chloride concentration below 100 milligrams per liter, which is desirable. But also we're not really maxing out the sustainable yield. And that's what we're going to test in the next scenario, where we're going to use the permitted rates for each of the aquifers. So the recharge stays the same. And now we're going to use the State of Hawaii Commission on Water Resource Management permitted rates. So you can see that from 20.2 million gallons per day, the withdrawals increased to 26.8 million gallons a day. And a couple of the wells now going to turn from yellow to green, from green to yellow, and even into purple areas where you're going to have a lot more withdrawals going on. This, of course, is of concern for the water department, and they want to now find out what else can they do. First, let's look at another thing that we look at, not only the chlorides, and that would be the effect on the freshwater lens in terms of water table and freshwater lens thickness. So the left side shows you the change between scenario 2 and scenario 1, which is the baseline scenario in feet. So the darker blue areas indicate large drawdown, and the light blue less drawdown. So you can see that in the center here in the Iao Aquifer, we do see large drawdowns up to 10 feet due to the increased pumping rates. Similar response is going to be seen in the 50% ocean water salinity depth, which is basically the depth of the transition zone between freshwater and saltwater. For another scenario, we're going to have, this is now one of the few that we select, that we developed with the Maui Water Department. And again, we're keeping the recharge the same, and we're now applying the withdrawal, which has been developed by the Maui Water Department to test out the limits of their aquifer system, of their wells, without exceeding the sustainable yield. And again, this one is going to be heavily pumping more from the north, and you can see that in the Waihe area up here in the north, a lot more wells turning into the category that it's not desirable, over 250 milligrams per liter. But of course, we're also pumping a lot more than they actually will. I think this is just to test out the limits. So again, you can look at water level changes and salinity changes. Again, large drawdowns in this area as well, but also more now in the Waihe area in the north. And yeah, similar effects. We're going to see a thinning of the freshwater lens due to the increased withdrawals. And more scenarios will be published in the report. The summary is in the same conclusion that Delwyn had, that model results indicate that the distribution and rate of withdrawals are important factors controlling the groundwater availability. And of course, additional withdrawals will influence the water levels, the freshwater lens thickness, and the salinity of the pumped water. And although this model has limitations in terms of water budget uncertainty, and because it's a regional scale model, it is still useful for the water managers to evaluate withdrawal scenarios and decide on which wells they're going to concentrate on pumping more if they want to get more water with the least effects that would be not desired. I'm going to pass it over to Jack, who is also a fairly new employee, a hydrologist at our system, and he's going to talk about groundwater in Saipan.
Thank you, Kolja. So yeah, my talk will discuss a groundwater project in Saipan that our office completed over the past 2 years. The associated report should be published in the next few months. The view in the photo on the right is looking south from the highest point on Saipan, and in the distance you can see Tinian, a nearby island. During the presentation, I will discuss the project's background and objectives, give a very basic description of the hydrogeology. I'll highlight the existing monitor well network, and then I'll discuss the various data that we had to characterize the status of groundwater in Saipan. So USGS began collecting hydrologic data on Saipan in about 1968, and that continued through 2005. During much of this period, we had a small field office in Saipan. And in fact, our current center director, John Hoffman, was the sole hydrologist operating the field office during the early 1990s. And my co-author followed him and operated the office from 1998 till about 2005. And after the field office closed in 2005, we haven't collected any data on Saipan until now, and there's very little published data or reports related to groundwater during this period. For our study, we had three objectives: assess the status of the monitor well network, review whatever data was available, including both USGS and non-USGS data, and measure the water levels and salinity profiles during 2 site visits, hoping to establish a baseline of groundwater status in Saipan to allow for future studies to definitively compare against. This is a general sketch of Saipan's hydrogeology that I made. The center and basement of Saipan on the left consists of low permeability volcanic rocks. The volcanic basement is surrounded by high permeability limestones forming several terraces out to the coast. A freshwater lens forms in the limestone units that surround the volcanic rocks. And just like in Hawaii, the freshwater lens floats on top of saltwater due to differences in density, and the 2 layers are separated by a brackish transition zone. Most groundwater production on Saipan is from wells in the limestone freshwater lens. The figure contains 2 different monitor wells, shallow well on the left and a deep monitor well on the right. Deep monitor wells are those that penetrate the transition zone between freshwater and saltwater and usually extend near or into the underlying saltwater. Deep monitor wells are very useful in groundwater studies, as you can see from Delwyn and Kolja's presentations, because they allow you to get a full profile of how salinity changes with depth in the freshwater lens system. Saipan's monitor well network consists of 14 different wells. 10 of these wells are classified as deep monitor wells drilled into and through the transition zone below the freshwater lens. There are also 1 shallow monitor well and 3 monitor wells that are in areas away from the freshwater lens system. Most of the monitor wells and production wells in Saipan are in limestone in the south. And on the map on the right, the black dots are monitor wells, the red dots are all the production wells. There's about 140 to 145 production wells. The blue outlines are the approximate boundaries of the well fields designated by the utility company and are sometimes used to group wells for analyses. During our visits, we determined that 4 of the 7 deep monitor wells in the south have obstructions preventing us from collecting any data, which is particularly unfortunate because that is where the data would be most useful and interesting. The primary and most informative data that we collected as part of this project are salinity profiles. To collect the data, we programmed the 2-foot-long probe that my colleague is holding to record depth, temperature, and conductivity at 1-second intervals, and then lower it slowly through the well using a powered fishing reel. This gives us a high-resolution profile of the thickness of the freshwater lens at each well that we profile. This is an example of 4 of the salinity profiles that we collected from 2 deep monitor wells in the south. The y-axis is altitude, the x-axis is specific conductance. Freshwater on the left, saltwater on the right. The left of the 2 dotted vertical lines represents the top of the transition zone, so anything to the left of that line is freshwater. And the right of the 2 dotted lines is the midpoint of the transition zone, which is another useful point for comparing wells and characterizing changes over time. We collected 2 profiles in most deep monitor wells about 7 months apart. The blue line is August and represents the conditions after the dry season. The orange line, or March, represents conditions after the wet season. The well on the left had about 30 feet of freshwater, and the well on the right had about 18 feet of freshwater. You can see that after the wet season, the salinity at most points in the well decreased, which is what we would expect after increased recharge. From the wells we profiled, the thickness of the freshwater lens was about 10 feet or less in the north of Saipan, about 20 feet on the peninsula in the east, and ranged from 0 feet to 40 feet in the south. And when I say the freshwater lens thickness was 0, there was only salt, or the water table was saltier than freshwater. So this focuses on southern Saipan. The black dots are the monitor wells and are labeled with the freshwater lens thicknesses determined from salinity profiles. The other dots are all production wells. The size of the dot is related to production rate, and most wells in the south and the freshwater lens withdraw water at about 40 to 60 gallons per minute. The color of the dot is related to the median chloride concentration of pumped water, determined from water samples collected twice a year. The darkest blue is less than 250 milligrams per liter, which is the EPA secondary standard for chlorides and is loosely defined as freshwater. And the darkest red is 1,000 milligrams per liter, which is pretty salty. If you remember Kolja's division in his presentation for chloride concentrations on Maui, the highest division that he had was greater than 250 milligrams per liter, which is only the second lowest for here. So very clearly, chloride concentrations in Saipan's freshwater lens and pumped water are much, much higher than Maui and the Hawaiian Islands generally. So there's a lot of variability in the median chloride concentrations of production wells. In the Isley Field and Cloverville well fields in particular, seemingly adjacent wells that pump at similar rates can have very different chloride concentrations. This isn't too surprising though, because much of the area is limestone that has developed subsurface karst features, which leads to small scale differences in freshwater lens thickness and chloride concentration. And the next thing I'd like to highlight is how much less saline the water is that comes from the Obion well field in the south. This was the most recent well field to be developed in the late 1990s, and much more thought was put into its design and layout, leading to neat rows and mostly equal spacing between the wells. It is likely no coincidence that the freshwater lens is thicker here and the pumped water less saline, relative to the two most adjacent well fields that have densely and irregularly spaced production wells. To analyze the chloride concentration trends, we use the Mann-Kendall trend test to see how chloride concentrations changed during 2009 to 19 at 146 production wells. Only 6% of the production wells had an upward trend, while 36% had a downward trend. In the south, where most of the groundwater production is, there was only one well with an upward trend and almost 3 dozen with downward trends. Unfortunately, at this time, we don't have enough information to give a good explanation for why it was mostly downward trends in the area. We have withdrawal data from 2014 to present and a lot of rainfall data, but those don't seem to be sufficient to explain the downward trends that we see. The decreases could be related to pumping practices, for example, pumping the wells more continually and at uniform rates, or perhaps raising the pump intakes in the wells to better skim from the top of the freshwater lens. And to summarize, the existing monitor well network on Saipan could be improved by refurbishing and maintaining the existing wells, which would restore the 4 deep monitor wells in the south that are currently unusable entirely. And from the salinity profile data, we determined that the seasonal variability of the midpoint of the transition zone is up to 10 feet, and the freshwater lens thickness changed by up to 4 feet in some wells. And these values probably underestimate the seasonal variability because our end of the wet season trip was delayed and we probably did not catch the maximum thickness of the freshwater lens. And then the thickness of the freshwater lens varies substantially even over relatively short distances. And more long-term data would allow us to better characterize the variability in freshwater resources. The layout of the well fields may play a large role in the salinity of pumped water for a given withdrawal rate. And since 2009, the chloride concentrations of pumped water generally decreased, although we cannot definitively explain why. And then we also have a report that should be coming out in the next few months. And with that, I'd like to thank the cooperators, which is the Office of Grants Management, CNMI, and the collaborators, which was the Commonwealth Utilities Corporation. And I'll drop the screen, and our next presenter will be Dr. Alan Mair of the USGS, who works on the potential effects of climate change and ecology on hydrology.
Good afternoon. Yeah, my talk today is going to describe an ongoing study that represents the combination of 3 separately funded projects that each involve the use of a water budget model to evaluate the effects of climate change and drought on groundwater recharge and drought. The effects, of climate change and drought on groundwater recharge and wildfire risk in Hawaii. Support for these projects is being provided by the USGS Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center, the State of Hawaii Commission on Water Resource Management, and Pulama Lanai. The main goals of this study are to provide information to assess changes in mean annual groundwater recharge rates between present and future climate scenarios. also to evaluate the effects of severe drought and long-term drying on vegetation, wildfire risk, and freshwater availability. And we're also investigating the capacity of cloud water interception or fog drip to mitigate the hydrologic effects of drought and long-term drying. The study involves the application of a water budget model similar to what was described by Kolja and Delwyn to estimate groundwater recharge and other water budget components for a set of present day, mid and end of century and drought climate conditions. The study area includes 6 of the main Hawaiian islands, specifically the islands of Kauai, Oahu, Moloka, Lanai, Maui, and Hawaii. The results of the water budget model simulations will be used to quantify changes in mean annual recharge and to summarize frequency characteristics of soil moisture, actual evapotranspiration, or ET, and climatic water deficit. Finally, the water budget model simulations will be used to quantify the effect of reducing and ultimately eliminating cloud water interception on these water budget components. So why is quantifying groundwater recharge, soil moisture, and ET important? Well, characterizing the spatial distribution of these components for different climate scenarios is needed to identify areas of potential vulnerability related to climate change, drought, and wildfire risk. This information, as Delwyn and Kolja highlighted, this information also provides critical input to groundwater models that quantify how human and natural changes affect groundwater availability, and to wildfire risk models that identify how drought and long-term drying may affect wildfire risk. Collectively, these types of information are needed by resource managers to manage potential effects of climate change on groundwater availability and drought and long-term drying on wildfire risk. The USGS has developed computer codes to estimate regional groundwater recharge rates and other water budget components using a water budget model approach. This approach requires input data that quantify the spatial and temporal distribution of precipitation, land cover, soils, runoff, and reference ET. The approach can incorporate inputs of cloud water interception, irrigation, and seepage from sources such as wetland taro, reservoirs, and septic systems. The water budget model approach is useful for estimating the effects of land cover and climate change on recharge and other water budget components. This study proposes to use selected high-resolution downscaled climate projection data sets from an array of available climate projections for the Hawaiian Islands. These data sets represent downscaled information from global models used to simulate the Earth's climate, including the Pacific region surrounding the Hawaiian Islands. These data sets were developed by researchers from the International Pacific Research Center, or IPRC, at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, using 2 downscaling approaches: a statistical approach, known as statistical downscaling, and a dynamical approach using a regional climate model configured for the Hawaiian Islands, hereafter referred to as the Hawaii Regional Climate Model. Shown here is a plot of projected island-wide mean annual rainfall anomalies plotted on the y-axis that were derived from an array of downscaled mid and end of century climate projections for 6 of the main Hawaiian islands, plotted along the x-axis. Almost all of these data sets suggest a drier future on all 6 islands. The greatest drying and rainfall is indicated for the SD, or statistical downscaling, RCP, or representative concentration pathway, 8.5, 2071 to 99 scenario, shown in yellow, with projected declines in mean island-wide rainfall ranging from 13% on Maui to 35% on Lanai. Only one projection, the HRCM, or Hawaii Regional Climate Model, A1B 2080 to 99, scenario for the island of Maui, shown in pink, suggests a wetter future with a projected increase in mean annual island-wide rainfall of 10%. For our water budget model simulations, we propose to use a total of 3 future climate projections per island to capture the range of projected future rainfall conditions on each island as shown here in this plot. This includes one mid-century scenario, the SD-RCP 8.5 2041 to 70 scenario shown in orange, and a second scenario that includes the driest rainfall projection, the SD-RCP 8.5 2071 to 2099 scenario shown in yellow. A third climate projection was selected to include the wettest rainfall projection shown in blue, green, or pink, depending on the island. An additional fourth scenario for the island of Hawaii is proposed, shown here in green, because of this high spatial variability and projected changes in rainfall across important recharge areas for this climate projection. Shown here are maps of projected anomalies in mean annual rainfall for 2 climate projections. ESD RCP 8.5 2071 to 2099 scenario is the driest rainfall projection, shown here on the left, and on the right, the HRCM RCP 8.5 2080 to 2099 scenario shown on the right. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the image on the left was generated using a statistical downscaling approach, and the image on the right was generated using a regional climate model. These 2 scenarios capture much of the range and projected changes in future rainfall. For example, a projected decline in rainfall of more than 50% extends across parts of leeward areas on all 6 islands for the SD-RCP 8.5 2071 to 2099 scenario, where in contrast, a projected increase of more than 30% occurs in isolated leeward and windward parts of Hawaii Isle for the HRCM scenario. The spatial variability of the SD-RCP 8.5 2071 to 2099 scenario, that is the driest scenario, is related in part to aspect. And this scenario suggests that leeward dry areas will get much drier and that some windward sections of Maui and Hawaii Isle will get wetter. The HRCM RCP 2080 to 2099 scenario indicates mixed patterns of wetting and drying across many parts of the islands. The water budget model will be used to assess the effect of severe drought conditions on recharge, soil moisture, actual ET, and climatic water deficit. Abby Fraser used a data set of drought index maps developed by Lucas and others to identify the most severe droughts in the Hawaiian Islands from 1920 to 2012. Shown here are the 2 most severe droughts she identified during this period. The most severe drought for the islands of Kauai, Oahu, and Moloka and Lanai occurred during the 5-year period from 1998 to 2002, shown here on the upper right, whereas the most severe drought for the islands of Maui and Hawaii occurred during the 6-year period extending from 2007 to 2012, shown on the left. Our next steps include completing the water budget modeling for these different present and future climate and land cover scenarios, and then publishing the results and presenting them to our stakeholders. Shown here is a list of the references to the sources cited for the study, including the climate projections. All of the climate projection data sets and drought indices maps considered in the study have been published and are accessible online. And lastly, a big mahalo to our collaborators for their invaluable support, and to you all for your attention today. And with that, I'll now pass it off to our last speaker. Cheng is a hydrologist with our study section. I believe she's been with our USGS for about 10 years now. And she's conducted numerous studies to estimate low flow characteristics across the state, and most recently published a report on low flow characteristics for the southeast portion of Kauai. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Alan. Can everybody see my screen and hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So aloha. I am one of many authors who worked on this study. The other authors include Scott Izuka, Joseph Kennedy, Abby Fraser, and Tom Jumbluka, who is also here in this meeting. So far, my colleagues have presented studies that are very data-driven, very different from this study, for sure. And results from these studies can be used to better manage our water resources. So I think we can all agree that a very important part of water resource management and protection is having good data. And this study looks at developing an effective data collection program that considers current and future water resource issues, a range of applicability, and data quality and accessibility. The study was done in cooperation with the Hawaii State Commission on Water Resource Management and in collaboration with the UH Water Resources Research Center. The main objective of this study is to come up with rainfall, stream flow, and groundwater monitoring programs that meet state needs for water resource assessment, management, and protection in Hawaii. Currently, the report is very near publication. Super excited about that. This is a diagram of the approach that was undertaken to develop the monitoring programs. We had 4 major tasks, which are outlined in the middle row of the diagram. They are identifying current water resource issues and priority areas, describing monitoring strategies, and defining data quality objectives. For this presentation, I'm not covering too much information on data quality objectives, but they refer to mainly the accuracy of the data that's needed to support various goals that are defined by the agency using the data. That's what data quality objectives mean. We held a series of stakeholder workshops to identify the current water resource issues in priority areas. The county water departments and the Water Commission had a lot of input on these 2 tasks related to surface water and groundwater. The WRRC had substantial input on all 4 of these major tasks related to rainfall. Many of the broader water resource issues, so we're talking about the need for reliable long-term data, climate change, land use change, and also the lack of information pertaining to public trust purposes or consolidated information pertaining to the lack of consolidated information pertaining to public trust purposes. These are all discussed in the Hawaii Water Resources Protection Plan. So with this framework that you see up on the slide, we evaluated the 2018 monitoring programs for rainfall, surface water, and groundwater, and selected additional sites for areas that were identified to have a data need. Here is a simple representation of the major components of the monitoring programs. The monitoring sites were selected based on their usefulness for characterizing anthropogenic effects to water resources or representing natural unregulated conditions. With the exception of the rainfall monitoring sites, the surface water and groundwater sites were grouped into 2 types of networks. So we're looking at the left box on the slide. In the resource management network, the monitoring sites are used to determine the effects of water and land use changes on water resources. And in the climate response network, the monitoring sites are used to determine the effects of climate change on water resources. Typically, the rainfall monitoring sites can be used to estimate water availability, as well as address climate change effects. That's why the rainfall monitoring program does not have a clear division between these 2 monitoring networks. The data collection strategies for the monitoring programs generally include periodic intensive monitoring and long-term monitoring. Periodic intensive monitoring is used to enhance the spatial understanding of hydrologic conditions and address water resource issues in priority areas. Some examples of this strategy include partial record sites for discrete measurements in the surface water program, or synoptic water level surveys in the groundwater program. The long-term monitoring is used to evaluate long-term trends and climate change effects. Typically, long-term sites monitor natural and regulated conditions. This is a summary of the priority areas determined for each of the monitoring programs. For the rainfall program, the priority areas include urban and agricultural lands, areas with high rainfall and high rainfall gradient, and areas within the trade wind inversion band, the TWI band. For the surface water program, the priority area or priority streams include those with major surface water diversions, those with established interim in-stream flow standards by CWRM or the Water Commission, streams with surface water management areas, as well as streams that support water leases. Finally, for the groundwater program, the priority aquifer systems include those with high withdrawal, declining freshwater storage and discharge, potential for future recharge reduction, little or no alternative sources, and also hydrogeologic uncertainties. So hydrologic uncertainties are related to the occurrence of groundwater. So we're talking about dike impounded, freshwater lens, thickly saturated, and perched settings. In the next few slides, I have maps of the monitoring programs showing the priority areas, the currently active monitoring sites selected for each of the programs, and additional sites to be included in the programs. These additional sites include reactivating discontinued sites or establishing new sites. For simplicity, information on the different types of networks and also the data collection strategies are omitted from these maps, but more detailed maps are contained in the final report. Here's a look at the rainfall monitoring program, which was developed in collaboration with the WRRC. Because Hawaii has high spatial and temporal variability in rainfall, the monitoring sites were selected to increase rain gauge density, as well as spatial distribution across all the islands. Also, priority was given to choosing sites with long periods of record, and the threshold that we used for the study was 30 years, as recommended by the WMO. For all the maps, this one and the other two programs, the priority areas are highlighted in yellow for consistency. And the rainfall monitoring program consists of 554 rain gauges. A good portion of them are active rain gauges as of 2017, so 381 to be exact. And these are indicated on the map with the green diamonds. And we need 173 additional rain gauges to be included in the program. And those are the red diamonds. If this program is fully implemented, effective rain gauge coverage would increase by 25% of the priority areas. Here's a look at the surface water monitoring program. The three key surface water resource issues that this program addresses include changes in surface water use, availability of stream flow during low flow conditions, and regulatory developments to allocate in-stream and off-stream uses. The program consists of a total of 202 sites. Again, a good portion of them are active stream sites as of 2018, and these are the green triangles. 60 additional sites are needed to supplement the 2018 program, and these are indicated with the red triangles. These sites are a combination of long-term continuous stream gauges that can be used to estimate stream flow characteristics, stream flow trends, regional hydrology, etc. And it also includes partial record sites for discrete measurements that can be used to estimate low flow characteristics in a critical area or priority areas, and also estimate gains and losses along a particular stream reach. We just lump these sites all together for simplicity here in this presentation. The surface water program also includes over 100 streams for seepage measurements that can be used to determine surface water and groundwater interaction. But these streams are not highlighted on this map, but they are included in the report. Finally, we have the groundwater monitoring program that addresses two major objectives. First one being the management of the resource itself, And second, assessing the response of the aquifers to climate change. The monitoring sites are distributed to improve the spatial coverage across the islands, improve representation of the various hydrogeologic settings, and also representation of where withdrawal actually occurs. The program, the groundwater program, consists of 67 active sites indicated by the green circles. And these active sites are currently monitored by the USGS, the Water Commission, and the Honolulu Board of Water Supply. Over 200 sites are needed to supplement these active sites, and those are indicated by the red squares. Data at all these sites differ, and they can include continuous water levels, discrete water levels, and salinity profile. The program also includes a set of synoptic water level surveys that can provide information on the spatial distribution of water levels within a priority area, region of interest. But this information is not included here for simplicity again, but they are included as separate figures within the report. I wanted to stress that this study is a very important collaborative effort between many different agencies. The state and county agencies, and to a great extent, the WRRC, provide current and future water resource issues, management goals and priorities, where the priority areas are, and data quality objectives. The USGS and WRRC provide technical expertise, reliable and scientifically sound data, and also decision support tools. In short, this study outlines where monitoring is needed. It provides guidelines on QA/QC, quality assurance and quality control, and it also encourages publicly accessible data. We truly hope that this study can be an important first step towards integrated water resource protection and management in Hawaii. Thank you. And I guess we're going to Q&A.
Thank you so much for the great talk from the speakers. So we have several questions. First question was from Paul Erie, and Delwyn actually addressed his question in the chat box. So about the data source in the islands. And also the second question from Roy Hardy to, I guess, Kuya. In your research, what permitted rates are these based on? So total permitted use through water use permits for, okay, so it's some numbers. It's not 19 milligram per day. Okay.
I can answer the questions.
Yes,
The
yes,
answer,
please,
the rates, you stating is only the IAO permitted rate. Included is also the rates for Waikapū, which is sustainable yield, and Waihe. That will add up to the higher rate, 26.8 or whatever that is. So I can follow up and send you an email about the details about that, Roy. So it's not only IAO, it's also the other aquifers.
Okay, yeah, just that there's no water use permits associated.
Right, it's not called permitted
so,
rate. Yes.
Yeah, it's not permitted out there, but EO is, yeah, that 19. So, okay, right. Thanks.
Okay, the next question was from Sarah about the USGS data set about the groundwater recharge and runoff map, and also the audience, one of the audience, Ted, actually answered this one also, and Delwyn addressed this question as well. The next question from, the second question from Poyeri to Chui, the last presenter. So in the slide of the approach, so you mentioned that there should be some sort of the compilation of all the data, hydrogeologic data and hydrologic data to evaluate the health of the resources, and for support the identification of priority area. So was this data compilation done, and can it be accessible in a single report file? So that's the question from Polly. Yeah.
Sure, thanks, Polly. So for this report, we did not compile any hydrologic data. It was mostly compiling a list of gauges, active, discontinued, and looking at to see if these gauges actually, you know, cover the data needs area that's needed. And if there are no existing gauges, discontinued or active, then we would establish new gauges. So for this study, we do not actually work with actual hydrologic data. And for the identification of the priority areas, those are mostly done with input from the state and county agencies, and for rainfall, with input from the WRRC.
Thank you. And the question from Jonas. So Maui Aquifer recharge by water flow back into streams. So was this done by data collection? It's probably no question to Koya about the Maui Aquifer recharge data collection.
I have not, wait, let me just see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kolja, that was based on the seepage run data?
Yes, that was basically the Waihe report that's Delwyn Oki published in, was that 2010, I'd say?
Yeah.
Yes, there's a report out there that evaluates seepage runs or seepage from those 4 streams, and based on that information, we estimated the recharge that goes back into the streams, back into the aquifer.
Okay, thank you. And the next question from Steve is to Delwyn and Koya again. So regarding the modeling efforts on Moloka and Maui, is there evidence of deep confined fresh water below the basal lands, such as found on Hawaii? If so, is this deeper ground model to be in communication with the basal lands? So there is some kind of interaction.
Well, not to the depth of what the deep monitor wells are. If there might be something beneath that, but we have no information from the deep monitor wells so far.
So do you have any comment, Delwyn?
Sure. The confined water, it may exist some places, but it's less likely to exist in others. For example, it's unlikely that you're going to find that groundwater that you find in Kona on the northeast side of Moloka. The coast is actually a rift zone. So there are a lot of vertical dikes that would tend to make that kind of confined fresh water less likely, because this would kind of penetrate through that zone and kind of change the groundwater flow pattern. Where you have 2 volcanoes, one overlapping the other, it's kind of expected that you would find some form of groundwater, kind of an older, deeper volcano. So for example, on the island of Oahu, we have the Waihe and the Ko'olau volcanoes, the Waihe being the older volcano. It's possible that you will find a zone of groundwater, fresher groundwater in the Waihe aquifer that lies beneath the Ko'olau. So there are certain conditions that would make it possible to find deep confined groundwater, and others that are less conducive to that condition.
I'd like to thank again to our USGS colleagues and researchers for the great talk. So Tom, do you have any some comments to speak to the wrap up of this seminar series this semester?
Yes, well, first of all, I want to thank the speakers today. This was a great presentation, and we had a fantastic group here. We had at least 90 people at least part of the time. So that just shows how much interest there is in your work. And we're super happy to host this, and we should try to do this on a regular basis to catch up with all the interesting work that's going on at the Pacific Island Water Science Center. So thanks to all the speakers. That was great. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to thank Harry for hosting and coordinating the seminar series, the WRRC and EKY seminar series this semester. You did a great job. We do appreciate that. And also thank April Cam and Pat Yurikawa for helping out with logistics. So thanks everybody for attending, and happy holidays to all. We'll see you next semester.